I plan to do this video in a while, and we're going to do all the graphics and all the normal stuff that we usually do. But Shane Warne passed away, and I had this script ready to go, and so here it is, I suppose, because Shane Warne changed where my family sat at the cricket. And he probably pretty much changed everything else about cricket in the era and the area that I was growing up in.
This is the last knot. My dad told me to say this.
So my story starts in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. Shane Warne was from the other side of Melbourne. My cricket club was called Camberfield, but the club was known at that time as Kimberfield because so many of our family played and scored and were on committees, and there were just a lot of us around at all times. And depending on who's telling the story, I either went to Camberfield match before I turned 1 week old or 2 weeks old. The club was where I grew up, and many of my first memories are there, hanging out with my mum or my auntie and watching my dad or my uncle play. And of course, when I grew up, that's where I started playing as well. I was there as a 7-year-old. And by 1990, I was a 10-year-old leg spinner playing in club cricket in Melbourne. And the real reason was my father. He was the coach of our team, and he told myself and my friend Dom that neither of us were ever going to be able to bowl fast, which he was right about. And that if we both chose a different kind of spin, our team would have one of each. For whatever reason, Dom picked off spin and I picked leg spin. And the entire idea came to my dad, who was a career number 11, because even though he couldn't bat, he could at least handle pace bowling. And against spinners, he was completely mesmerized. And his thinking was, well, if him, a fully grown adult man who played cricket for 30 years, couldn't pick spin, then chances were a bunch of kids wouldn't be able to either. There weren't really many good role models for spin in Australia at that point. Greg Matthews was kind of making more of an imprint as a batter with an extravagant action, and Peter Taylor, who was more of an extravagant action than almost anything else. Peter Sleep was the other Australian spinner you saw a lot of in that period. He was fascinating to watch, but it looked like he had double dislocations of his shoulders at certain points. None of them were really hugely inspiring to any of us. So we just started bowling spin any way that we kind of could. The thing is, though, that both of us had almost instant success. I seemed to take wickets every game, and Dom took a 5-wicket haul early on, and I was wicketkeeper for that. And I just remember kids just dancing down past him and getting completely lost. They were so confused by it all. And I remember playing a non-league game, like some sort of charity game or something, where there was 9 adults and 2 kids playing. And in that game, I took 4 wickets, which was a pretty big deal for someone who just turned 11 years old. And everyone was really happy that I was bowling spin, and no one seemed to know how to play it, but no one seemed to care that much either. Players, coaches, anyone, it was just not that talked about. Leg spin was just something that just happened. So for the first couple of years that I bowled it, I just kind of bowled it without anyone really noticing. But me and Dom did keep taking wickets. But he was just a far better cricketer than me, especially as a batter, and he ended up going to a better club as a batting all-rounder, and probably just became a batter by the end of his career. And he'd go on to play district cricket, and my path was never anything like that. Dom's off-spin was really neat and tidy, and I bowled like a kid trying to get the ball out of the back of my hand. I was probably pretty accurate for a leg spinner, but I was still a young leg spinner, so things went horribly wrong, and occasionally I'd miss the entire pitch and bowl the ball over the batter's head. And I wasn't as good a batter as someone like Dom. My batting was very agricultural. I could hit the ball a long way, but there was no real technique there. And so I figured if I was going to get better, it would in part be through leg spin. So I watched a lot of Mushtaq Ahmed, who around that period was in Australia a lot, and I remodeled my bowling a little bit more on him. And I got a decent wrong in, and I took more consistent wickets from that point. And then I read about every bit of leg spin I could in old coaching books and listened to everything that Richie Benner or occasionally even Kerry O'Keefe would be saying on spin. And at that point, I was usually the only leg spinner in that match. And I think at one point, I was probably the only leg spinner in my league. There just weren't that many leg spinners around. And so I was having a good time as a kid, slogging the odd 6 and picking up some wickets. And then 1992 comes around, right? And it's the Boxing Day test in Melbourne, and I can catch a train directly from my house to the ground. It's awesome. And my dad says we can only afford to go to one day of the test. We can go to day 4 or day 5. Now, by this point, my dad had trained me up so much about cricket that I knew day 4 was the better option for me, because I was going to see more cricket. Day 5, I might not even see a whole day's play. So I went to the MCG on day 4, and I saw a young Damien Martin that make some really handy runs. Day 5, which was my dad's choice, Shane Warne took 7 wickets. I think in some ways over the years, I felt like we were missing out a little bit by missing that. The thing is that you don't really miss out on Shane Warne moments because there was always another moment. But I suppose that there wasn't another first. It was the beginning of it all. There had been a flash of something at the end of the Sri Lankan test, but Shane Warne didn't really exist before that flipper to Richie Richardson. And because of me, my old man missed it. But that's also the period where everything started changing. I turned 13 just a week later, and almost straight away, all the senior players who had nothing to ever say about my bowling were now suddenly obsessed by leg spin. It was the thing to talk about in Australian cricket. You know, put away your mustaches and your chest hair, it's flipper time. From that point forward in my life, if an adult asked me about cricket, everything was about Shane Warne. And it didn't really matter if I mentioned leg spin or not. Like, cricket was Shane Warne in Melbourne at that period. Like, even less than a year after Shane Warne's 7th, even as, you know, a 13, 14-year-old boy, it was quite clear that I was in a new world. I remember the under 16 and senior coaches were suddenly giving me like a lot more attention, and people were talking to me about my cricket far more than they had before. Even when I would come on to bowl, the opposition umpire would be asking about Shane Warne. The language of cricket changed almost every time Shane Warne got a wicket. And in the 90s, Shane Warne got a lot of wickets. I remember going to the MCG for a coaching camp and we were taught the flipper. I was about 13, 14, but there were like 10-year-olds there trying to click their fingers with a ball in their hand. Warne was everywhere as well. He was almost instantly went beyond like a cricket star. So it meant that people didn't know anything about cricket knew about Warne. And all this time, my bowling kept getting better and better, so I was happy with the extra attention. I fielded in for the under-16 team when I was a bit young for a final, and I took a bunch of wickets there, and every adult in the game was talking about my leg spin. Although it was no longer my leg spin, it was Shane Warne's leg spin, and then for kind of everyone's. This all made it worse when the next year I turned up to bowl, my first year of under-16s, and sadly I could only bowl wrong, and something biomechanically had gone wrong, and I couldn't work out what it was, and there were experts everywhere because everyone listened to Richie on the TV and watched slow motion of Shane Warne, but no one actually knew, what was happening. As it turned out, I was in the middle of this big growth spurt, which only years later I worked out was probably the cause of most of my problems with leg spin. I went from starting the ball quite low and letting it go high and then dropping down, to when I had my growth spurt, I was already a much higher, and I either bowled too flat or too high. My bowling just fully fell apart. It was only years later when I understood a lot more about cricket biomechanics and technique that I realized all the things that I'd ever done were wrong. And so that one year, I didn't even bowl leg spin because I couldn't. So I just started bowling off cutters as like a third change medium pacer. And the worst thing was, at this point, everyone was a leg spinner. In fact, it didn't even matter that I didn't bowl leg spin that year because we had other leg spinners in our team. And it wasn't just when I was playing club cricket or school cricket I could notice this. When I grew up, all my uncles were seam bowlers, and I was the first spinner in the family. But then two of my cousins after me also took up leg spin. Like when I played backyard cricket on Christmas Day, I could see the Shane Warne effect right there. And luckily for me, I actually did manage to pull my bowling back a little bit. And the next year, I was taking so many wickets with my leg spin that I got offered to be captain of my league's representative team. And I also got a spot in the Dowling Shield, which was the under-16 district competition in Melbourne. The team that picked me was North Melbourne, which was a bit of a laughingstock at the time, but a couple of decades earlier had players like Ian Chappell and Paul Sheehan, Alan Hurst, Alan Connolly, also Saqib Mohammed and Gary Sobers and Rowan Kanai. Like, it was a proper club back in the day. Of course, it wasn't really that kind of club when I played there. It was kind of forgotten about. And weirdly, there is no longer a North Melbourne Cricket Club. It's now moved out to Greenvale, which happens to be just down the road from Camberfield. But that all happened way too late for me. And at North Melbourne, we had a 15-boy squad. And I was one of 4 leg spinners in that squad. We also had an offie as well. Not that anyone really cared. But all the other leg spinners were really batters who would just come in and rip the ball in the nets. And, occasionally they'd take a big haul in a game. I was probably the only specialist frontline bowler of the lot. And that kind of pattern happened over and over again. In my high school cricket team, I was picked as a batter because they picked another leggy who'd never really bowled before. But when you gave him the ball and he came into the nets, he would pitch the ball anywhere and just rip it across the front of everyone. When he was in a game though, it didn't really work because it worked in the nets when everyone was running down trying to hit him back over his head. But when you actually play proper cricket, people milk you square of the wicket and people are better at playing it. And him and a lot of the guys out there, they weren't really leggies, they were rippers. And that was the leg spinner I was being compared to. And I'd take more wickets than some of these people. But everything I did didn't really look that exciting. And it didn't matter that I rarely got hit because this other guy was spinning the ball 2 or 3 times as much as I was. And out of the 4 leg spinners at North Melbourne, I was probably by far the worst batter. So they picked all the guys who could bat for the first game. But when a couple of them failed, I got called up for the second. It happened to be that the captain of my team came from my school and he didn't really rate me that much as a bowler. And so for the first 48 overs of a 50 over game, I didn't actually bowl. And then he brought me on for the 49th over because he got his sums wrong. The other team was already around 300 runs at this point and they were smashing us everywhere. It's a nervous time to come on as a leg spinner and bowl at that point. And my first ball was a drag down and the batter missed it and was bowled. And everyone laughed. My next ball, the batter came down the wicket and missed a big slog and the keeper missed it as well. And the next 4 balls were plays and misses. Somehow I'd bowled a really good death over by starting with a half tracker. The thing is, it was my only over of the tournament as well. And it was partly because I was told I had a bad attitude, which I assume came from 2 things. One was questioning why I bowled leg spin at the death for my first over. And the other one was when I went out to bat, there was actually 2 leg spinners bowling and we were like over 150 runs behind. And if there's anything I learned from Shane Warne, it's when you face an opposition leg spinner, the idea is to try and hit them as hard as possible. And I tried to do that and I went out. In fact, of all of Shane Warne's tricks that I ever learned anything from, it was probably that one of the batting that probably was the only one I could get close to mastering. I could slog a leg spinner occasionally. That same year I played senior cricket full time as well, and I took a couple of big hauls in between bowling like 30 and 35 over spells, usually into the wind. If I was bowling well, which was rare, but did happen, I wouldn't get too much advice. The minute I bowled a bad ball, they just told me just walk in and rip it. Every time. And I didn't walk in, and I felt like I was ripping it, but I didn't bowl like Warne. And that was part of the reason my last ball was short, right? Because I wasn't anything like him. Then if I bowled too many wrong uns, I'd be told that Warne didn't need wrong uns. Well, of course he didn't need wrong uns. He was Shane Warne. And if the ball wasn't spinning, I'd need to try harder, as if there was like a magic switch I could have to make the ball spin more. And then if I tried to spin it harder, of course, and I lost control of it, they'd say I'd have to work on the accuracy. Because there was no right answer when you were talking about being like Shane Warne. He spun the ball more than anyone else while being more accurate than anyone else. You could copy like one or the other, maybe, probably neither. Putting both of them together was impossible. And I did try and replicate what he did physically, tried to copy his bowling action. But I had a different body type and I wasn't as strong as him. I would love to have bowled like Warne, but I couldn't. And no one could really help me to do that. They were just saying, walk in and rip it, as if that was the magic way of bowling. After my juniors finished, I actually left Camberfield and I went to play for Coburg. And one of the things my dad asked me when I went to that club was whether I wanted to have a bowling coach. I think at that point I'd taken quite a few wickets, and I think he knew that it was pretty much all self-taught and that I knew how to get wickets, but not really how to bowl. And if I wanted to get better, I was going to need proper guidance. So I found a number for a spin bowling coaching in a cricket magazine and I called it. The person who picked it up was like working for a trucking company or something like that. And I quickly worked out, or I'm pretty sure anyway, that it was Ray Bright, the former Australian spinner. And I have no doubt that he could have improved my bowling. But he'd ask me a question and then I'd give an answer and he'd suggest the remedy. And it was the same every time. He was just trying to turn me into another Shane Warne-like bowler. And I knew that this bowling coaching would cost a lot of money and we didn't really have that much money. And I knew that no one would be able to turn me into a Shane Warne type bowler. I was rake thin and I had no shoulder strength and small hands. Plus the wrong one was my best ball. I needed momentum through the crease like Mushtaq Ahmed or other less famous Victorian leg spinners like Craig Howard. I wasn't a bowling expert, but the one thing I knew was I couldn't be like Warne. In fact, by that point in my life, I had a theory that no one should try and copy him. Most of the players who did in club cricket were just shit because they didn't have his strength. And if they could rip it, they were usually really slow. And I was already slow. When I tried to bowl like Warne, it was even slower. None of this actually stopped me from going on to play a slightly higher level of cricket. But even as I got better as a bowler, there was obviously always a ceiling for me. And it really came from the biomechanical problems within my action. I had a very strong front arm, but it went out to the left instead of looking through the gap, which meant that I wasn't getting the rotation through my action when I pulled. And so as I got to the higher level, I could bowl a little bit faster, but it just meant that I got absolutely no spin. And I would have liked to have bowled a little bit more like Kumble or Mushtaq, but if I ever bowled more than like one wrong and in and over, or slid a few balls through straight, I'd get told off. Warney doesn't need him, mate. In fact, I remember one captain screaming at me from slip saying if I kept bowling wrong uns, he was going to have to change the field to one for an off spinner. Leg spin was everywhere and everyone knew about it, but only that one kind, and Shane Warne kind, and I couldn't do that. And we had good cricketers around us, but the coaches weren't particularly experts on spin, as many of them just viewed it as off-spinning darts or just coming in and ripping it, which was fine, but I couldn't do either of those things. The weird thing through all this is that I suppose in my life I identified as a leg spinner. But I found like I'd found this magic art that I knew more about than others, and I was, I don't know, part of a movement. And I loved every long hop and wrongin'. Plus it suited my personality, the bowling, but also like discovering it before it was cool. It was like seeing Kings of Leon when they were like a sweaty southern rock band before they became, just pop stars with guitars. And obviously my amateur leg spin career died out because I couldn't fix my action, and I probably wasn't good enough. Even if I had a perfectly biomechanically operated action, I had small hands and slow arm speed, and I would never have got near to making it even if I was a lot more biomechanically perfect. And eventually I played less, as the only work I could find as a high school dropout was usually shift work or something on weekends. And me not playing cricket was no great loss to anyone. There was little chance of me ever becoming like Bryce McGain type player and working it all out in my late 20s. I just didn't have the physicality that I need. And also, basically, as I got older, by, I don't know, maybe 1998, in Melbourne specifically, leg spin was now just another form of bowling. The novelty of it had really disappeared because it was just so common and everyone was trying it. In fact, if Warne had any big effect on cricket, specifically in Melbourne and probably most of Australia, it was just that leg spin became normal. There was obviously a period of everyone looking for the next Warne, but that seemed to disappear when all the spinners that came after him were clearly not at his level. In fact, the best leg spinner after Warne was McGill, who's, roughly the same age as him? Warne inspired thousands of people to try his forgotten art. None of them mastered it. Of course, Warne was still a big deal for years to come. He basically became cricket's Elvis, right? A freakish talent who became a genuine freak, sideshow, headline. It's weird watching the person who affected your life so much become one of the most famous people in the world, largely for being famous. At a certain point, Shane Warne wasn't a leg spinner anymore. He was megastar. He was the guy that was paid by a bookie, failed a drugs test, had multiple affairs, got caught in so many scandals, had a threesome sex tape, dated Elizabeth Hurley, and thought we descended from aliens. I mean, the leg spin just becomes second or even third to Warne the champion and Warne the celebrity. For me personally, the whole relationship changed as well, because now he's just a familiar face in the press box, and occasionally the, hotel bar. I still remember the night he bought me a drink while complaining that my order was too confusing. And I never really got to know him. I did interview him a few times and talk to him a fair bit. What I really got from him was he really had this overgrown boy energy, this real passion for things. For whatever he liked, he loved it so much. And it didn't matter if a professional stylist now looked after his clothes or, his face wasn't the same shape it was when I was growing up. He just had that energy that I remembered when I first watched him bowl. And I could have got to know him better, but it would have been very weird for me to be able to do that. It wouldn't have actually worked, I don't think, any sort of relationship we would have had, because I would never have known how to have a relationship with someone who had such a big impact on my life. And even later on, how do you have a relationship with someone who, is talking on TV about ancient astronaut theory, right? And right now, here, I don't know how to process his death. I just told you this incredibly personal story of me, but it's all about Shane Warne, right? And now Shane Warne's gone, and it just happened, and I don't know what to say. This is a cricket channel, and it would be right to focus just on cricket. But Shane Warne wasn't cricket. He was Shane Warne. And I lived my cricket life with him there the whole time. And to go back to the start, I mentioned that he changed when my family sat at the cricket. As I said before, my dad was a fast bowler, and the thing he liked best was to sit square of the wicket and see the speed and the bounce and the carry. And I remember at my first test, we were square of the wicket watching Wasim Akram bowl. I still remember it being a young boy and thinking, that ball is moving too quick, I cannot see it. And a couple of years later, we didn't even go to Boxing Day as much. My dad wanted to go to day 3, day 4, day 5, because those were the Warne days. And when we sat in the ground, there was no point sitting square of the wicket. You're watching Shane Warne as close as possible to being straight on. We had to see what Shane Warne was doing, right? And yeah, we missed the 7-wicket haul. But me and my dad saw the hat trick. And we were as straight behind that as we could be for people with cheap tickets. And when I left junior cricket, my dad stopped coaching me, so he didn't come and watch me as much. But as I played senior cricket, occasionally he'd come down and he'd watch a little bit. Now, obviously I wasn't Warne, but he always did the same thing. He would sit at like a mid-off angle, never at point. That's some impact, right?